To the cloud. Okay, I think we're recording now. Welcome everyone to our recorded session of Kathleen Douglas's presentation on resilience in the voluntary sector. We are just making up for our technical glitches that we had last week. So we really hope you enjoy this presentation. We're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. PAVR recognizes that our work and the work of our members takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. We recognize the inequalities connected to colonization and commit to working towards creating a just, inclusive, and vibrant community for all. We encourage you to use native-land.ca to learn more about the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples where you live and work. And we wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we're using, and honor all of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the land since time immemorial. We invite you to reflect upon this land acknowledgement, what it means to your personal story, and what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action mean to you. So once again, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Douglas. I'm going to be sharing her slides, and I think that's all I need to say today. Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alex. Could we have the next slide, please?
Yeah, there might be a little bit of a time lag.
That's okay.
So let's see. More technical. Oh, there we go.
Great. So I'd just like to introduce our team who has worked on this session and for all their hard work from last week. So thank you very much to Joanne and Alina and to you, Alex, for your patience. Next slide, please. So why this session? Why this topic? Well, like you, my plans changed a lot in 2020 due to COVID-19 and its effects. The death of a family member, lost income, unpredictable COVID-19 rules, changes in clients' priorities, the social, political, and economic twists and turns, and the constantly changing anxiety levels of friends and family. All have resulted in having to let go of Plan A and get comfortable with Plan B, and often even having to deal with a Plan C. In our sector, we know that a better world is possible, but we need compassionate, adaptable leaders to make it happen. And I know that you're the right people to hear this. Change is accelerating, and resisting it can carry dire consequences. Seeing through the fog during this tumultuous moment requires an openness to learning, growing, and investing in a new way of doing business. Next, please. Thank you. Defining resilience may sound easy, but it's a more complex concept than you might think. First, resilience is not only about bouncing back, but also about experiencing some sort of growth, such as finding meaning or purpose and maybe even self-awareness. Second, although some people seem disposed to deal more effectively with stress and anxiety and to better regulate their emotions, resilience is not a single trait that you either have or don't have. Resilience is dynamic. You can be resilient in one context, but then your capacity for resilience or your ability to draw on available resources just might not be enough for another, possibly even more demanding or difficult situation. So the lesson here is that we all can be more resilient at one stage in our lives, but less so in another. Lastly, being resilient doesn't mean that you won't have a wound or a scar. Consider the study of New York residents in the wake of the terrorist attack of 9/11. Researchers found that 65% of these questioned had returned to their normal level of functioning within 6 months. While we are not at that level, remember too that you might be capable of more resilience than you realize, especially during the international issue around us. We in the sector tend to think of others before ourselves. That's just who we are. Dealing with the effects of the pandemic, we need to translate this into our own physical health and mental wellness. And so we need to take care of ourselves. The basics are, which we know but may not practice, get regular hours of sleep, plan for healthy snacks during the day, get some exercise during the day, take breaks. So we've got a poll here. And Alex, can we put the poll up? And even though you're not able to respond, Alex, when you think about this poll, what would you say has affected you the most since March 20? Have you had more virtual social calls? Have you been part of lots more meetings? Tell us a little bit about your experience.
Oh yeah, I've done all of these things for sure. The virtual social calls and even just phone calls, just regular old phone calls. Sometimes people say to me, I'm zoomed out. I just want a
Yeah,
phone call."
yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and we've done the family meetings over the internet. It's been a bit of a journey getting my parents on to Zoom, but they're managing it now, right? Um, Fun stuff, yeah. Like sometimes my daughter sent me one day. She sent me, oh, there's a play that's going to be online. Maybe we could watch it together, right? So, definitely, I've done all of those things, and it helps a lot for sure.
Good. Thanks for sharing, Alex. I appreciate that. And maybe those of you who are participating in this can look at this poll and just reflect on what's been happening with you. And as you're doing this, it would seem that we have become a society based on good internet connections. So recently, we've only had to dress up from the waist up, as most of us are on virtual calls, so that maybe even our dry cleaning bills have been drastically reduced. So let's move. During difficult times, it is common to want to withdraw from the world, and this can be for a variety of reasons. Although there's nothing wrong with wanting solitude during challenging times, may I suggest it is also important that you stay in touch with people, at least to some extent. For those of us who are introverts, we may be celebrating this forced alone time, and yet we still need to connect. If you choose to contact and work with others, connect with others, and nurture those relationships, as opposed to isolating yourselves, you tend to become better at coping with adversity and growing through the experience. So, when difficulties are overwhelming, try reaching out to others who can provide support. Even if this feels uncomfortable for you, asking for help is hard, but most resilient people are usually aware that they can't on their own. Next, please. So maybe you can think about some of the things that have been positive for you in the last 9 months. I'm sure there has been something. This could be time spent with family, a more balanced day, less stress from commuting, being able to put a scented candle on while you're in a meeting, which you couldn't do at the office. One thing of which I am certain, acceptance is not about giving up or quitting. It's about gently noticing what's going on and allowing disagreeable experiences to exist without attempting to change or deny them. With acceptance, you can choose to do what really matters to you and follow your own values more easily. It's how you respond to the situations. Another strategy for building resilience is to find growth opportunities in adversity. Oh, sure, Kathleen, that's fine for you, Miss Pollyanna. But what about me with a spouse out of work, school age children at home all the time, housework that never seems to end, and all the other things that sort of go with a different life now? Now, just as a note, we are not going to discuss serious mental health aspects or unsafe homes because those are grave issues which require professional support. Thinking back to our environment, you'd be surprised at how many opportunities one can find in a stressful situation or even a traumatic life event. Looking at things this way is known formally as cognitive reappraisal or cognitive reframing. Now, don't mistake this approach for positive thinking, though. You're not denying the negative or trying to make yourself think positively. Rather, you're turning your situation into a source of inspiration and finding meaningful opportunities in it. So think about some of the positive aspects from the chat box. Or, sorry, think about some of the positive aspects from your own experience. Could we have the next slide, please? So now we are where everything is hardest, in the messy middle. And here's why. When the pandemic hit, we were collectively freaked out and energized. We had never experienced anything like this before. We bought groceries for our neighbors. Restaurants gave away free meals to seniors. People were singing from the balconies and sewed masks. We had to massively change the way we work, educate our children, shop, and socialize. It was new. It was scary. It was necessary. We had the energy of novelty. With vaccines coming and other changes on the horizon, many people are optimistic. But we're not at the end of the pandemic. We are in that messy middle stage. And that's a phrase from Harvard Business School's Elizabeth Moss Cantor. The adrenaline is gone. We need a hug from someone outside of our household. The messy middle is hard, and 2021 is not going to be anything close to what we thought is normal. And I use that term figuratively. And you know what? We may have to shift what our normal is. From this moment on, we might always be wearing masks when we're out. We might be automatically physical distancing. Who knows? Maybe we can reframe how we refer to today, not so much as disturbing times or uncertain days, but just as today, because we don't know what tomorrow looks like. Could we have the next slide, please? So, how can we build resilience? Instead of just waiting for it all to be over, accept the things that we can do to re-engage with the things that bring us meaning. So let me ask you, what do you want to take with you when this is all over? Well, I'm sure a lot about 2020 was bad for you. This is a time to reflect on what was good. We saw some positive feedback from different people across the different social medias. Did you find purpose in baking bread? Did you shop for someone who's elderly? If you didn't leave the house much, what did you like about being home? What were the bright spots? Did you find that you were more grateful for all that you have? Where in your life would you like to step things up? Perhaps you'd like to continue donating to a food bank or helping people who can't leave their home. Maybe you want to set up a gratitude practice or spend less time on social media. Avoid that dangerous TikTok. Where can you do better despite the constraints and challenges of the pandemic and everything else? Here's a hard question. What deferred maintenance do you need to take care of? What most of us really need right now is less stress. Could you resolve to go to bed a little bit earlier, a few days a week? Or would you have more energy if you improved your diet? Remember, when you are depleted, your most valuable asset is damaged. In other words, when we underinvest in our bodies, minds, or spirits, we destroy our most essential tool for leading our best lives. I found this to be my biggest challenge. I don't like the winter months, as many of you know, so I don't go up much. I prefer to have at least one winter vacation, but sometimes more. And that didn't happen this year. So now I have to make the effort to get exercise inside, to eat a balanced diet, double up on my vitamin D, and enjoy those sunny days while reading a good book inside in my library. Could we have the next slide, please? There is something very important about the separation that we used to get from work. Jyoti Samra told CBC, not only are you leaving the house, but you're leaving all of the troubles, challenges, stressors, and the other things that we have at home. And this worked similarly when leaving work stress and returning home, or it did. That separation gave us a natural recharge, she said. So we'd recharge for our personal life by going to work and vice versa. And now the two are just colliding together in this way where we don't have any escape from anything. And so it's best to literally build boundaries. Commutes are forced pauses that signal the time to transition from one's work identity to another identity, such as a parent, spouse, or a friend, says Ravi S. Gajaran, an associate professor at Florida International University. Working full-time from home during the pandemic makes it difficult to transition between work and home roles. For you, however, commuting might have been a ritual that was critical for your mental health and work-life balance. Enter the rise of the, and I love this phrase, fake commute, wherein people replace that daily transition with walks, maybe just to the post box or the corner, or for something else, maybe the same time or mileage that your former trip might have taken. I thought it was quite interesting, and I don't advise this, but this is something to pause over. Some people drive to their office building, stay in the car, and then return home in time to start work. Maybe not your thing, but it's just an interesting action that's happening around the community. So let's talk about those ubiquitous online meetings. It's hard to smoothly hop on a work related Zoom call right after dealing with a demanding situation with kids at home or an argument with a roommate. In fact, it's really hard to leave behind the stress of our daily life and all the Zoom calls because experts say several factors lead to video meeting exhaustion. So I do appreciate being part of this session. Users can feel like they're performing for the camera more than they would while meeting colleagues in person, especially when software continuously displays to a user their own live image, adding an element of self-awareness. Marisa Shuffler, an assistant professor in industrial organizational psychology at South Carolina's Clemson University, calls it having to be on all the time. Video meetings with multiple participants means everyone's brains have to absorb multiple interactions, and doing it on a two-dimensional screen requires much more cognitive effort than in a boardroom. Our brain is working harder, and that's making us feel more tired, and similarly, we're more stimulated. So our brains are getting a little bit confused with all this different kind of input. And from everything I researched, despite all the predictions about how COVID-19 could lead to a more permanent remote workforce, the truth is more likely more nuanced. The pandemic will leave an indelible mark, but the workforce of the near future will probably be something of a hybrid affair. I guess that means we have to adapt to working at home or in a hybrid arrangement between the office and remote work. And just think about how you want to spend your day and as much as you can control. Remember, we talked about accepting and controlling? I find that I tend to spend way too much time on my computer without taking a break. So I have learned to set an alarm for every hour just to get me up and walking around, even if it's to catch up on the dishes or putting the Roomba on or just to walk downstairs to refresh my drink. Hopefully, you've got some other ideas on how to work at home. Okay, Alex. Now, let's switch to our organizational resilience. Perhaps it is the time to start looking at how you can engage different forms of volunteering to build up a sustainable volunteer program in the messy middle of now and whatever it looks like after COVID-19. We know that globally, 70% of those volunteering are involved in informal volunteering, and that number is growing year after year. Shining light and engage your volunteers to accept the trend. You want your volunteers to share your positivity, to let them know you care and are looking forward to welcoming them back. Remember, these are your recruiters of future volunteers. Imagine Canada's status report says that charities are also experiencing challenges with volunteers. 49% report difficulty engaging volunteers in current working conditions. 33% say volunteers are less available. Arts and recreation organizations are facing particular challenges. They are more likely to report decreased demand, organizational capacity and revenues, leading to greater layoffs and work reductions. Maybe this applies to some of you. Not-for-profits are having more difficulty transitioning their programs online and developing new programs because traditionally, charities have been divided into fundraising and programming. Instead, many are ceasing or suspending operations. Overall, just over a quarter of those polls say demand has held steady, while the balance have seen those reporting capacity decreases significantly outnumbering those reporting increases. Any of this familiar to you? Can we have the next slide, please? What have you observed in your internal business practices? Think about this. We would normally get you to share in the chat box, but I just want you to consider it. We know that we've had no real historic data to build on how to act today, unless any of you were around who survived the Spanish flu, which I doubtful. Some of us were here for the SARS outbreak, but that was a weak sister compared to today. Our organizations and maybe you as individuals have to had make changes to our whole supply chain. You may have had to increase or purchase personal protective equipment, PPE, and physical barriers. You've had to decrease or change your regular suppliers. Cleaning now includes sanitizing, where the office is closed to do deep cleaning, sometimes every 2 hours. And even maybe the delivery process itself has changed, not only at home, but at work. Who has started to employ more home grocery delivery services or up their use of takeaway delivery options? For work, how many of you have had to source out PPE before? How many of you didn't even know about PPE? How many of you didn't even know what it was? We've had to cast a wider net for providers and suppliers. Some of the smaller companies with whom we've dealt for many years may not be able to provide all that we need today. And so those smaller outlets may not even survive. So we have to open our nets, contact our colleagues, and search for new or additional suppliers. What about canceling events? I think we've all had to do that. What were the penalties or losses? For the sake of basic risk management, you may have just signed the contracts with maybe a cursory review for social or fundraising events. But now you want to double check those contracts for cancellation clauses. I was registered for an international conference in June of 2020, and of course it was canceled. They are still wrangling with the insurance companies. What you want to see going forward in your contracts is what's called a force majeure clause. This is a contract provision that relieves the parties from performing their contractual obligations when certain circumstances beyond their control arise, making the events inadvisable or making the opportunities commercially and practical illegal, or maybe even just slide, please. Planning for 2021. Let me start off by saying, please be kind to yourself. Be grounded in the fact that despite whatever you plan, because in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, all can change. That says it all. May I recommend that you become less attached to any one plan. Be open-minded and open-handed. Consider the risks and a variety of options as a very real possibility right from the start. Remember, you are making decisions based on the best information you have at the time. And so hopefully you are less likely to beat up yourself if things don't go exactly as expected, and more forgiving of those who make commitments they can't keep. Some folks are really struggling with accomplishing what they need or want to do because they don't have the corporate environment to drive deadlines. Maybe you can relate to that because it seems like we've got all this time. You may want to focus on being a better listener, paying attention to new information and trends, keeping up with your knowledge, taking time to understand the reactions and deeper feeling of those around you, and evaluating how all of that requires you to adjust your own plans, yet still moving forward to achieve the important goals. You might be finalizing your objectives and laying out your plans for 2021. My suggestion, give yourself a present, a figurative new box of sharp pencils, and maybe throw in an eraser for good measure. It's a mindset as well as a practical tool. Next slide, please, Alex. Now, Alex, I'm going to ask you to think about the one thing that you would say that's been your experience with your volunteer program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've gone through it all, Kathleen. Like we put the program on hold, and then in July we reopened. So my agency runs a clothing bank for newcomers, people on a low income. So then we reopened in July, and then we were running till about end of November when we went into that next lockdown. So we actually had volunteers coming in during that period. We just were very, careful about limiting numbers. So,
Right.
so definitely not the last option. We did not continue as usual, but the all of the three above, we certainly had to try, and now we're just waiting.
Right. Thank you so much, Alex. And I think that's where a lot of us are, because some volunteer programs are not currently operating or have been drastically curtailed. Others have fundamentally changed or even expanded since March. We know this. We are living this. Volunteer engagement professionals, you may find it challenging that a program you have successfully delivered for a number of years can no longer operate in today's world. However, this time can present an opportunity to reflect on the operation of your whole volunteer program or some of the segments of it. Volunteer engagement within the context of today's environment raises many questions as we assess the evolving risks and needs in our communities. What is an organization's duty of care to volunteers, staff, and clients? And how does public policy, legislation, and emergency measures across multiple jurisdictions during international public health crisis apply to our volunteers? Ramping up, closing down, or modifying services during a pandemic? You might need to increase services in order to respond to the enhanced vulnerabilities that come with physical distancing and self-isolation, especially if you're dealing with seniors. Well, you may have to close other programs and ask volunteers to stay away, delivering those one-on-one services. So we could hear the next slide, Alex. We all know that communication is a crucial component of volunteer engagement. Volunteers look to us to provide information about opportunities, organizational changes, and current needs. COVID-19 has caused uncertainty for many, and effective communication is a top priority. Now is an important time to be transparent with volunteers and remind them that their contribution will go a long way in providing support and relief to those affected in the community. Before making any sort of announcement about radical changes or cancellation of programs, please talk to your key stakeholders like board members or your clients or colleagues, your key volunteers, maybe your funders, and anyone who will be affected. The last thing you want is for key people to find out the news through gossip or social media. As you consider who will be affected, be decisive and plan ahead as far as you can. It can be tempting to hang on as long as you can before making the decision to close a volunteer program. You might be hoping for a last-minute reprieve. However, being decisive and setting a date can give you the space to plan orderly suspension or cessation of your volunteer program if needed. Remember that if you say, "We'll get right back to you," then volunteers will be expecting to hear from you. So may I suggest you don't make false promises? The same goes with colleagues and fellow staff. Be open and honest with your colleagues about what's happening. Answering a question with, "We don't know yet," is better than rumors and speculations run riot. You want your volunteers to come back, although I'm sure there's a couple you'd rather not if you're honest with yourselves. But you just can't send your volunteers an email in 6 or 9 months asking them to report back for duty. That's not realistic. Plan how you're going to communicate with your volunteers, just as you would design any communication strategy. Are there media opportunities that you could use to highlight what you achieved despite everything? Share some good news stories. I'm sure you've got good news that people want to hear. And you understand why people are upset. I mean, this is, for a lot of our volunteers, this is a big deal for them. You've had the time to plan and absorb the news. Bear in mind that the announcement may come as a shock to some. Volunteers often have a long association with your organization and feel a very high level of commitment and a sense of ownership. We're not talking a daily press briefing, but regular communications will go a long way for your volunteers and you. Next slide, please, Alex. Let's talk about how to use social media, the medium of the moment. We know that social media is a good tool for keeping your agency front and center in volunteers and donors awareness. To balance this, do your Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok followers a favor and target your posts in meaningful ways that engage them. It will demonstrate that you respect their time and make them more likely to read your social media communications. Try providing a tidbit that will enrich their lives in some way. For example, this could be a practical tip or a news story that ties in with your mission. Be brief. Posts with 80 characters or less are much more likely to be read. Don't feel the need to post multiple times a day. This is maybe a little bit over enthusiastic. The Buddy Media report finds that organizations who posted 3 or more times in a day had 25% lower like rates and 42% lower comment rates, overall having a 29% decrease in engagement. Social Bright adds that agencies do not even have to post daily. In fact, just a couple of times per week is sufficient as long as those posts are on a consistent basis, maybe something that you put in your schedule. Again, it's about being aware of time. If the posts are too lengthy or if there's too many, your followers will tend to feel it's not productive to wade through them and instead skip over them. And they'll skip over what you have to say. So there's also something you can measure when you're considering your efficacy of volunteer engagement. And again, you want to build up this information for when your programs start to look a little bit like they did before. You want to measure the number of likes, comments, or shares for future reference. This indicates that you've got some engagement. How have you been communicating with your volunteers other than what you've always done before? Think about what you can do, what you have done, and what's working. Perhaps a weekly volunteer recognition. Could you post an image of a volunteer, with their permission, of course, and a message highlighting the impact that they've had in your mission? You might even ask your volunteer to write their own personal message explaining why they care about your mission. It's a kind of a testimonial to then post in your organization's social media feeds. Either way, you're taking an extremely personal approach to recognizing and celebrating the supporters who drive your mission forward. During times of virtual only engagement, volunteer recognition is something that can easily fall by the wayside if not actively pursued. Even those small gestures like weekly shout outs and other ideas will help to keep your recognition efforts built as we go towards April's Recognition Week. Building a culture of engagement and recognition, as we all know, is one of the most effective ways to retain long-term support and ultimately make it easier to recruit more volunteers in the future. There is a future, folks. Slide, please. I think we can agree that it's easy for volunteers to feel lonely and isolated during this time of COVID-19, particularly those volunteers where volunteering is a big part of their life. And as we just talked about, recognizing volunteers is a standard best practice, but today I think it's even more important. And your thank yous should go maybe a little bit further than in the past. Here are some ways to recognize and appreciate your volunteers that might put a smile on their faces. For some of you, this is old hat. To foster a stronger internal culture of recognition and appreciation, maybe ask your team members at all levels, including your director or your supervisors, other support services, maybe even your board members to help write a personal thank you message, maybe a card in the mail. If your organization's virtual or in-person volunteer opportunities directly impact your clients or service users, maybe organize a letter writing campaign for your broader community to express its gratitude, some of those community partners with whom you work. By this point, your own organization has certainly shifted one or more of its engagement strategies to the digital sphere, likely through social media and virtual events. And so perhaps you can use those same platforms to recognize your volunteers by hosting a unique virtual event just for them, just to celebrate their contributions and encourage further engagement. And using these events helps to discuss the impact of the volunteers. It thanks our volunteers, explains the work that still needs to be done. Slide, please. So today or tomorrow, your volunteers are going to be returning, either slowly or en masse. The organization will be different to when they last saw it. If your agency decides not to restart established volunteer program, as we said before, you need to communicate that. Once it's safe to do so, we will want to welcome volunteers back with open arms and with the safety and well-being of volunteers and those they help has to be paramount, bearing in mind that many volunteers may currently be cocooning and may be reluctant to return. While I'm sure you're all familiar with the necessary health and safety requirements and guidelines, it's critical to ensure that volunteers with specialized duties, such as those who interact directly with clients, are adequately trained, skilled, and knowledgeable. When necessary, the use of PPE, personal protective equipment, and hygiene practices must be clearly communicated as being required and or provided as a precondition to volunteer so that they know what to expect from the get-go. By definition, volunteers are not covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but once they do volunteer, they are under a duty to act reasonably and without negligence. Volunteers will be held to a general standard of what a reasonable person with similar ability and experience would do in similar circumstances. Before inviting your volunteers back into their role, it may be advisable to contact them to discuss some of the options for returning. Not all your volunteers will be ready to return. You could send a questionnaire to each volunteer prior to their return with questions that may include asking if the volunteer feels comfortable returning to the new role, or if they'd like to stay in their current role, or would they like a different placement. Another question you may want to ask is whether the volunteer would like to put their position on hold until they feel ready to discuss their return. Some volunteers will feel guilty they're letting the organization down if they're unsure about returning. So please assure them that they know their health and safety and their well-being, as well as others, is your number one concern. Slide, please. If you decide to use a risk assessment type tool, please note to remind the volunteers that the organization is collecting this sensitive personal data for the purposes of maintaining safety within the workplace in light of today. The legal basis for collecting this data is based on vital public health interest and maintaining occupational health and safety, and it will be held securely in line with your data retention policy. So I want to ask if you know anyone who's using a questionnaire or a tool like this. If not, the resources that we're going to talk about at the end will give you some ideas of where you can find them. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a simple template that can help you guide discussion with volunteers professionally returning to their assignments. You may want to discuss changes to the health and safety practices and levels of responsibility, including the use of PPE or newly created protocols. You want to discuss if there's any other circumstances that they need to disclose or ask to allow their safe return to volunteer. They might have some differing pre-existing health conditions, for example. Discuss local response plans and new measures based on your community to address the risk of COVID-19, including the current advice on PPE and social distancing. Volunteers will look to you with trust and guidance, so plan for consistent, helpful, and useful conversations. Can we have the next slide, please? To ensure the health, safety, and well-being of volunteers, we've had to explore alternate ways to volunteering. So let's look at a few suggestions. An approach like this may help keep volunteers engaged and keep your volunteering program sustained by providing different routes to return to volunteering. Virtual volunteering, as commonly defined, is voluntary work completed in whole or in part through technology. It is not a replacement for face-to-face volunteering, and a combination of on-site and online volunteering may work best where it's possible and feasible. Can you, as a volunteer engagement professional, adapt your existing physical roles to become virtual ones? Can you create or modify new virtual roles to meet the day-to-day organizational or volunteer program needs, such as data analysis or other projects that maybe have been put on hold because you just didn't have the time? This is not about creating busy work. It is a useful way to keep your volunteers engaged and tackle those on-the-shelf projects. As an example, I'm working with an organization right now who's looking to build a manual for their volunteers and their staff. They have never had one before because they didn't have the time, so I'm helping them with that. Volunteer Engagement 101. Skilled volunteering is essentially lending volunteers experience to benefit our agency and our clients, and this can have a hugely positive impact on the organization. You might consider recruiting skilled volunteers to help improve your website. If that's feasible, again, you might want to work with your other colleagues on this. Can your volunteers help source funding? Can your volunteers help source funding applications in response to the many new grants that are arising in response to the pandemic from both government and the private sector? Maybe one-on-one online befriending, capturing oral histories of the organization. Can your volunteers lead virtual skills class or workouts? An idea which we have used to ask volunteers to review the volunteer recruitment content on your website. Um, this is really helpful. Asking your volunteers, and this is a really useful project, by the way, how many clicks does it take to get from the front page of your website to your volunteer pages? What is the state of the potential volunteers about how important volunteering is to your organization? When you get to the page, how much information is provided? Following your social media policies, can you get a virtual volunteer to assist with your upgrading or designing, updating your web or your volunteer pages? You might have to spend some time developing online tutorials or learning opportunities. And with the next slide, I'll give an example. This is a very real invitation. Alex, thank you. I've changed the identifying organization. So you may want to lead or have a colleague or your teenager offer a free training for your volunteers, especially those who are uncomfortable or lacking in confidence in using the virtual meeting programs. This can also benefit those who are socially distanced from family members. Is there other training your volunteers will need before they return? Can you offer them a place and a free webinar which you can't attend, because there's tons of free webinars out there, just as a thank you and a recognition? Just one cautionary note. Don't assume, well, we know what that means, don't assume all seniors need this type of training because of their age. And don't assume that all young people or students are the right ones to teach. Open your own concept on this topic. And connecting virtually is not going away. So take advantage of the trend to arm your volunteers with new or enhanced skills, because I can tell you they'll be very grateful to be asked or included. Can we have the next slide, please? So this would have been a poll. And Alex, I'm curious as to how you can take advantages of online resources.
Yeah, we actually, earlier on in 2020, we had contacted we have an infection control specialist that we have been in touch with through one of our local hospitals. And she actually did a really great training session with staff and volunteers.
Great.
And I'm actually I've contacted her again to talk about the vaccination, because we are noticing amongst some of our staff that some of them are expressing some hesitation around vaccination, right? So I thought she'd be a great person for them to just ask questions, right?
Great.
And the other thing I have done for sure is all of the between July and November, when we were offering our volunteer opportunities, we shifted all of the orientation and training online.
Great, thank you
And
so
it worked
much.
really well. Yeah, so
Good.
it's been great. I've been happy with it, and I would actually like to continue. I might do one a month that's in person, and then one a month that's virtual. But I just find with the virtual, you can get more people, I think,
Absolutely. Because I think if we're honest, many of us are getting used to our own online training. And so let's bear that those opportunities. Can we have the next slide, please?
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the end here. Thank you. So let's examine how your organization's volunteer program can stay relevant and valid now and in the coming months. Are there new ways volunteers can be engaged to ensure the volunteer program remains an integral part of your overall organization? What types of upskilling needs to be completed at this time? What core policies or documents, processes, and procedures can be reviewed, updated, and developed to ensure your organization's volunteer program is meeting best practices, guidelines, and standards? Most of you know the value I place on policies as essential tools for a well-led organization. When was your volunteer policy last updated? Do you have the time to review its content? Is there a time to revise the policy to reflect new types of volunteering? How do you consider DEI, diversity and inclusion, in your policies? This is a very timely and appropriate topic to investigate. If your volunteer handbook or orientation is not current, perhaps volunteers can help you update it. The basic volunteer strategy asks, where are we going? This might be the opportune time to update or develop a volunteer strategy to give direction. Always keep in mind that we have to be businesslike. Remembering strategy is more than just a numbers game or collecting quantitative data. It's about developing a volunteer value proposition, which is a whole another webinar. But we have to embed the significance of the volunteer program and the strategy, which becomes a key element in your business case. Do you need to rehome your volunteers, or can you actually deliver services without them? It's hard questions. It's a hard but necessary question that speaks to the value proposition of the volunteers. And others may be asking you this. What will volunteering look like in a year's time? To some degree, you can control your response, maybe not the environment. Some people may be more reserved in the time they give to volunteering today, and the health impact may have a long-standing effect on volunteers' own health and well-being. With that in mind, don't expect your full volunteer cohort to return, as some will just call it a day, and others, they might just disengage as they never felt connected once the program stopped. So again, let me reiterate, keep in touch with your volunteer team. Next, please. So here's a sample volunteer program action plan that's been developed to illustrate the types of outcomes, outputs, and activities that may be relevant in long-standing volunteer programs, both now and in the future. Ultimately, it is up to you, with support from decision makers and colleagues, to decide when and how you might put these strategies in place and what works best for your volunteer program and your organization. As a basic example, you might want to identify new volunteer roles. You might want to identify and update pre-COVID-19 volunteer roles to meet relevant national guidelines in relation to other programs. And remember to set measurable targets. You may want to conduct a volunteer survey just to identify current volunteers' professional skills, experience, qualifications, certifications, and other interests so that you can create or update your database and use those experience and expertise. You may also conduct a volunteer risk assessment and implement the necessary control measures to reduce the risk for all new and updated roles. So use today for planning for tomorrow. Next slide, please. We're all familiar with the safety message from the air cabin crews, the very beginning, to put your own oxygen mask on first. One of the first messages of this webinar is important. This type of action plan puts you in control, puts your oxygen mask on, allowing you to safely help the person, your volunteers, who may be struggling to get their own mask in place. This is also a basic risk assessment tool. Next slide, please, Alex. So let's review what we heard today. You have to put on your own oxygen mask before you help others, valuing your own health, well-being, and safety as much as you do others. Create a positive work environment wherever you can with a balanced day, a reasonable expectation of what you can accomplish, and an appreciation for all that you do have. Dig down to create, recreate, re-envision, and adapt your own programs as much as possible. Use your time to learn some, share some, work some, laugh some, and rest some. Keep in touch with your volunteers as much as possible and strengthen your recognition efforts. That's the last slide, please, here, Alex. These are the resources which I have used, and all these resources, I'd like to tell you, the one I found the most useful and practical is Volunteer Ireland. I would put this on your bookmarks because it's a fabulous resource. You're going to see some of the resources I used here with permission. So here's a sample of resources. There's lots more to check out. Some of them talk specifically about dealing with today. Some of them are just about helping you. But I think overall, it gives you a good sense of some of the resources that are out there. And I think our Pavro website has some resources around COVID. I think we'll be putting some more resources up there in the next little while. And Alex, I'm going to bring you into the last part of this because I think we're going to be sending this webinar out by email and posting it on the website. Is that correct?
We will indeed. Yes, for sure.
And I'll have the last slide there. And I thank you for your patience. And again, I do apologize for last week. I wish that it was as smooth as today is, because today it's perfect.
Yeah,
Thanks,
exactly.
Alex.
Practice makes perfect, right, Kathleen?
Absolutely. Let's blame it on the platform.
Exactly. Thank you so much for today's session. And we might have to take you up on the volunteer value proposition webinar for next time.
Right.
That sounds like a really good one. So thank you so much. And we will be in touch soon. So I'm going to stop the recording. There we go.